You are literally a machine, but that is a good thing, assuming you know what you're doing. So, we've all encountered these types of people. For example, yeah, bro, I'm totally red pill Chad, but I've been like this, bro. I swear I was like this before I watched tape, bro. Please, bro, believe me. We've met people like that, you know, with literally every other trend that comes along. Out of nowhere, they switch their personality, their lingo, their mannerisms, their way of speaking. And this really shows us something about the cultural myth of being yourself or be yourself. So, we often hear that being yourself in this day and age is a strength amidst a storm of ever changing fads and trends. But this extremely old advice is really out of place, especially in today's day and age. Now, the idea for this video originally came after I saw this quote. It's from Gurdjieff. I believe that this quote actually came from The Fourth Way, which was actually written by Uspensky, his protege. Really good book. The audiobook's free on YouTube if you guys want to listen to it, but let me just briefly read out the quote to you guys. Man such as we know him, the man machine, the man who cannot do, and with whom and through whom everything happens, cannot have a permanent and changing and single eye. His eye changes as quickly as his thoughts, feelings, and moods, and he makes a profound mistake in considering himself always one and the same person. In reality, he is always a different person, not the one he was a moment ago. So, really, in this very detailed illustration, I kind of break down the self. So, the quote unquote self, what we really think of ourselves when we think of self. Here's what we think. We think that the self is authentic, rigid, and unchanging, like a square. It's preset. Somewhere in a quote unquote factory was just built, we're born with it, and we're like that, right? Well, we can say that there's some like core and basic temperaments and mannerisms that people just generally have. The reality is that the self, for the most part, is malleable, susceptible to outside influence, which is very important because they literally, literally everybody from marketers, politicians, advertisers, people bent on world domination, they literally take advantage of the fact that the self is highly susceptible to outside influence. And it is also very highly conditioned. Now, this is where I guess the silver lining lies, right? With the self. Since it's so susceptible to influence in general, one can very easily modify the self in order to benefit, the individual. But there's a common roadblock that people usually walk into that we'll discuss in a second. So the advice of being yourself obviously assumes that a stable self that operates within every individual um, is obviously far different from what can be observed. That stable self doesn't actually exist. We're actually quite mechanical in terms of self. Day-to-day behaviors are controlled largely by unconscious processes that seek to economize mental energy usage. And as a result, the path of least resistance that agrees with the strongest I present in the individual at the moment will almost always be chosen. And this often clashes with the desire for change or specific results within an individual. So, take for example somebody who wants to get rid of a habit, right? Normally, what's the way you get rid of a habit? Well, you try to cut the old one out and you introduce a new one in its place. But really, if the new habit doesn't agree with the strongest present I, well, obviously the habit might keep up for a week or two, but it will be rejected, right? Think about people who take up New Year's resolutions. Most of them really stop by the most. They'll last about a month, right? But really, this can apply to any sort of new endeavor that you want to change. Maybe you want to leave your job, or maybe you want to get a new job. You want to find a new hobby. But if all of these actions, keyword here, actions, if they don't line up with the new with the strongest I that's present in the individual, well, obviously it'll just be rejected and you'll be pulled back as if a rubber band was tied around you and you just get pulled back into the old I. That's why most people just repeat loops for most of their life, right? Even if the loops are negative for them. So, attempting to project an authentic self in every single situation will inevitably lead to dysfunction. We often praise honesty as being like a very desired virtue, but when you actually think about it, honesty is not really 100% introduced because if everybody was speaking 100% honestly, then the world would be a very dysfunctional place, right? For example, we see in this little illustration the Chad's talking gibberish, and the Wojak girl's like, I have to go. And really, if you see a lot of, um, I guess, these sorts of dating interactions, when the guy goes off on a tangent just talking about, like, politics and whatever other junk that only he's interested in, obviously the girl's anxiety spikes and she leaves. That's why a lot of dudes don't do really well because they end up talking about what they like. But the bigger picture here is that, the Chad's being authentic. He actually likes talking about, what does he say here, like flat Earth or whatever, or conspiracies and politics and all this sort of shit. He actually likes that, but really it's not the right calibration for that specific situation. So we move on to another example of this. Why the psychopath beats the schizo on the public stage. So if you guys have been seeing YouTube recently, a very, I guess, debated topic, not even debated topic, but discussed topic, is the psychopath versus the schizo versus the normie. And we're going to really talk about why the psychopath generally beats the schizo in terms of like the public stage and social dynamics, etc. And if you haven't seen like I guess this breakdown here's like a very good picture just detailing some basic differences between the psycho class and the schizo class, right? Yeah, also photo credits to the Schizo Dumps YouTube channel. Go check them out. Lots of good content from him. So, the dichotomy of the schizo and the psycho highlights the conscious use of the persona for advancement in society, right? So, the individual with the least amount of fixed points within their identity, who is willing to adapt more to any social situation by acting differently, will inevitably go further than the person who is more dogmatic in how they identify themselves. The schizo often lacks the same level of social calibration as the psychopath, who is much more skilled at putting on masks. And while the schizo believes that being authentic and sticking up for the truth is a worthwhile endeavor, which it certainly is, but oftentimes, that's one of the defining characteristics of the schizo, the autist class, right? That they're too uncensored, right? There's no censor when it comes to how they express the truth, right? And oftentimes this backfires and creates animosity and, quickly triggers the NPC blowback if you want to go into the topic, right? But essentially what I'm saying here is that even in day-to-day situations, specifically work, there's always individuals who seem to be liked by everyone. And this is usually a sign that the person is quite fluid, quite fluid and conscious in the curation of their persona, depending on the circumstances and people with whom they deal with in that specific situation. So that's one of the things, that separates the psycho from the schizo, right? And the psycho's willing to change his personality, while the schizo is like very steadfast and sticking up for the truth, right? Now, that is to say, something can be learned from the situation. Whether you consider yourself a good person or a bad person, you, at the end of the day, want to be, you at the end of the day want to be a effective person, right? In every sort of scenario possible. So that requires calibration. Calibration creates results. So behavior is not static. It adapts to environment. You do not need to speak to a close friend the same way you speak in a professional setting, and you intuitively understand this difference. You don't even have to think about it. Calibration formalizes that instinct. It means recognizing the demands of the situation and selecting the appropriate behavioral expression. This applies across domains: first impressions, work environments, social gatherings, romantic dating contexts, all of it. The principle is identical. Context determines the optimal behavioral signal and subsequent behavior. So let's get into the practical side of things. How do you actually apply all the stuff that we've just talked about in the past few minutes? Number one, you start with identifying unconscious patterns within your own behavior. Like Jung said, one of the biggest goals that people have in life should be making the unconscious conscious. When you do this, it no longer dominates your life. You no longer call it fate. Faith. Why is it happening to me? You understand that there's patterns that lead to behavior, that lead to actions, that lead to results, right? So if you're serious about results, the first step logically isn't being yourself. It's first observing yourself, taking a step back. Watch how you behave when you're tired. Watch how you behave around attractive people. Watch how you behave around authority. Watch how you behave when you feel insecure. Watch how you behave when you feel empowered. All of these things. You'll notice something uncomfortable. You're not consistent. You're usually reactive. Certain environments activate certain versions of you. Certain people trigger certain emotional scripts and also trigger certain versions of you. And those scripts are not chosen, they are conditioned. The self you defend so passionately is often just a collection of habits deformed either recently or long ago, usually around specific experiences that left deep imprints within your psyche. And this is to say that if your current results are unsatisfactory, it's not because the world does not appreciate your authenticity. Rather, it's because your conditioning does not match your desired outcomes. Again, the eye is formed by this conditioning, right? This conditioning leads to behavior. This behavior leads to actions, and these actions lead to results. It's all a cycle. Even in Hermeticism, we have the concept of as above, so below. So really, the external is a reflection of the internal, right? With the internal being conditioning and the external being the results that come from this conditioning. So, for example, we have this little Pepe comic right here. We have Wagey Pepe. Perhaps his desired outcome is perhaps to leave the job. Maybe he doesn't want to be a wagey. He wants to be free. He doesn't want to be a slave anymore. But if he's been conditioned to just accept a salary or a paycheck every 2 weeks or month or whatever it is, then his conditioning, which is really Pavlovian in that sense, every 2 weeks expect this reward. And, in exchange for this, you get this. Well, obviously, his conditioning is not going to match his desired outcome. His desire, at the base, it's a desire. His desire is to change. But if conditioning does not match your desired outcomes, then you'll never really get the desired. Better said, if the conditioning is not the correct conditioning, you will never get the desired outcome because, again, the conditioning leads to the action. So here's another thing that you can practically do. You separate your identity from behavior. If behavior produces weak signals, like nervous tone, defensive humor, over-explaining, rigid honesty, bad body language, then it must be adjusted. But first, how do you do it? Well, obviously you observe. And this is not fake at all. This is actually really intelligent. You already just do it unconsciously. You probably lower your voice in serious conversations. You try to clean up your language and sound polished in professional settings. You change your posture when someone important walks in at work or at school, whatever. The only difference now is that with calibration, you're making the process conscious. It's no longer unconscious. It's deliberate persona construction. Instead of asking, how do I stay authentic? Ask, what behavior does this environment reward? What behavior will give me the most leverage in this environment or this situation? Instead of asking, is this really me? Just ask, is this effective? Is this behavior going to help me in this situation? Because at the end of the day, you're not betraying yourself by adapting. You're literally upgrading yourself. Carry out these little practical reframes and observations with the ultimate goal being, replacing the unconscious behaviors that are hurting you in social situations. And before you know it, you'll be Tuxedo Pepe. So yeah, guys, that's been it for the video today. I hope you guys enjoyed. Again, join up on the Discord server. Lots of free stuff in there. And yeah, looking forward to seeing you guys again.